The title of my book is Most American, Notes from a Wounded Place. So this essay really states my thesis, I suppose you would say, about Oklahoma's history. In it I say that Oklahoma's history is a compressed, ironically inverted miniature of the national narrative, unfolding in a matter of days and weeks and months, sometimes hours, rather than decades, as with the rest of the country. And that's why it's so intensified here. So this is the land that gave birth to 20th century America's premier athlete, a Sac and Fox Indian, Jim Thorpe. Its definitive white working man's hero, Woody Guthrie. One of its most celebrated black novelists, Ralph Ellison. And its deadliest pogrom, the Tulsa Race Riot, all within a few dozen years and 100 miles of each other. Oklahoma is the only place anywhere that ever spawned committed struggles to create an all-black state and an all-Indian state. And yet the very first laws enacted by our virgin legislature when we became a state were Jim Crow laws. They were laws of segregation. And still, we have more incorporated black towns than any state in the nation. Still, more native tribes survive and thrive here than anywhere on the continent. But with the added irony that in Oklahoma, most of them don't live on reservations. In the land of the red people, which is what Oklahoma means, two Choctaw words, Okla and Homa, meaning red people. In the land of the red people, Indians have lost most of their land. Through the Allotment Act, through theft, through murder, through chicanery, through legislation. One of the things that's most important to me to express in the essays is the quintessential nature of Oklahoma as a profoundly American place, both by its history, by its culture, its contemporary culture, and all of the forces that have gone into creating this state. And so that's the most American part, and that's the title essay. And then there's another essay called A Wounded Place, and that creates the subtitle. And it speaks of specifically of Oklahoma's racial wounds. The westward encroachment on native lands moved west from the eastern coast across the continent. The inversion of that is that actually natives were taken from their homelands, and not just in the southeast. That's what we think of mostly, the so-called 5 civilized tribes as the dominant culture has named them: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, Muskogee Creek. Were taken from their homelands and removed here. But this was true from all over. So if you look at Oklahoma and where it's situated in the physical map, we're not the heartland. We're the gut, we're the belly, we're the underbelly. And so native tribes were, if you look where all of their original homelands were, they're spread all over the continent, and they were concentrated here in the middle. And so that's one of the ways. Then Oklahoma became the promised land for a number of whites who came here. We have the great Western myth of the land runs, and so that perpetual migration and encroachment from the native point of view of white settlers that happened really all across the continent happened here like in one day. They had the land runs, and a gun went off at noon, and people pounded south in the land runs and staked claims, and those were primarily people from the dominant culture. There were African American and there wouldn't have been Native American, but other ethnic peoples who also staked those claims, but they were mostly white. So the overall narrative is concentrated and happened and unfolded at such rapid pace in the latter part of the 19th century, moving on into the 20th century. And Oklahoma's only been a state since 1907. It's like the 46th state. So other states much further west had become states before we did. So those are parts of the ways. I think also it's the coming together here of African American, Native American, and Anglo-American peoples that created a racial cauldron that boiled over in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in the pogrom that is called now the Tulsa Race Riot, though many will say that is not the proper name for it, and it isn't. Many call it the Race Massacre. It was an assault by some 10,000 armed whites on the wealthy, well-to-do black community of North Tulsa that was called Greenwood, that happened in 1921 on the night of May 31st and June 1st, 1921. And it's the most massive assault by white Americans on black Americans that happened. Those kinds of things were happening. They happened in Florida, they happened in Arkansas, they were happening in other places in that time, but nothing to the degree and the drama and the complete destruction of a very, very wealthy, well-to-do community of successful and prosperous African American people living in a certain kind of autonomy here in Oklahoma. So, and then it was covered over. That history was disappeared. And it's the way that, in a lot of ways, we have disappeared our national narrative altogether. We don't really want to think about our founding in slavery. We don't really want to think about or own in any, except the most sort of broadest outline strokes, the genocide of Native people, or the ethnic cleansing that happened with the removals when masses of people were moved here on what has become called the Trail of Tears. And those are parts of the ways. And then I think about Oklahoma's our contemporary character. You know, we in the early part of the 20th century, we were the most red state on the left, which is that there were more the socialist candidate for president in the early 1919, I think, election, that early part of the 20th century, Eugene V. Debs, received more votes in Oklahoma than any other state. It was a strong union state. It was very, very, had a very progressive and socialist underpinning. And then now we're one of the most red states on the right, and that's happened within a century. And it reflects a lot of elements having to do with the larger culture. The dominant culture here is it's very religious. It's still predominantly white, unlike other areas of the country. It's very conservative. It's very rooted in the land. And in those ways, I think it's also part of how it reflects the national narrative and the national culture. So we have these natural disasters. We have the tornadoes, which Oklahoma is so infamous for. And when something happens, like there have been several devastations of the city of Moore, which many people know about. When that happens, and there's an F5 tornado, and everything is laid flat, and people are suffering, the people of Oklahoma come together in really profound ways that erase all of our divisions. And that's also, again, the way Americans do. So we had the Oklahoma City bombing, the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in 2005, which in many ways, presaged 9/11 and how people responded after the Murrah bombing. Some people ask me, why do you go there? Why do you have to go unbury all this ugliness? What's important for us to? It's smoothed over. It's at least scabbed over, if not a nice smooth scar. Why open up that wound? And it's because really the wound can never be healed unless we do that. And then. So it will continue to erupt every few decades, every few years, every few generations, until we come to own what the true nature of our history is.